Hello everyone, this is our lecture on Central Europe, the former Soviet Union, and Scandinavia. So on the map you can see roughly the areas that we are going to be looking at. This lecture is going to be in three different parts. The first part we're going to be talking about the Central European nations. So as you can see on the map, Germany, Austria, Hungary, Romania, the Czech Republic, Poland and those countries in there, really everything right up to the border with the former Soviet Union. We'll be talking about the former Soviet Union itself, and you can see on this map we have Russia, but we also have Belarus, Ukraine, Lithuania, Latvia, Moldova. Those are the countries that you can see on the map that are independent now, but up until 1989, they were all part of the Soviet Union. 1989 was, of course, when communism fell in this part of the world, and all these different countries reestablished themselves. We'll also be talking about Scandinavia, which includes the countries that you can sort of see on this slide, the southern ends of them. That is, of course, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, and we'll also be talking about Iceland a bit as well. So let's start by talking about Central European immigration to the United States. If you look at the slide here, in 1990, 58 million Americans were of German descent, which means that of people here in the United States now, the vast majority of us, roughly about 1 in 6, have some German heritage. And the reason for that is that Germans started arriving to the American territories very early, as early as 1681. Earliest German settlement was in Pennsylvania. And at that time, you may have heard the term Pennsylvania Dutch. And Pennsylvania Dutch actually doesn't represent people that come from the Netherlands, as you know, Dutch people come from Netherlands. It actually, Dutch is a corruption of the word Deutsch, which means German. So these were Germans that were coming from Central Europe and settling in America and creating settlements. So 1681 is an awfully long time ago. We know that in another lecture, when we talk about Northern Europeans, we know that there was a big bunch of people coming from Great Britain, British territories, around that time as well. But there are a lot more people that claim German ancestry, because there's a lot more of them coming at that time. So very early in great numbers. The picture on the slide that you see there are German immigrants arriving at Ellis Island, which is one of the was one of the sort of the processing facilities for new immigrants into the United States, and it's in New York, right in the harbor there, near the Statue of Liberty, actually. You can go online and you can look and see if you think you might have relatives who have come into the United States from Europe during this time. You might be able to find their names on there, and I believe I've got that in this lecture somewhere. We can take a look at that a little bit later. Many of the German immigrants that were leaving and coming into America at that time were looking for religious freedom, and so groups that are still in that area today, in Pennsylvania today, such as the Amish and Mennonite religious groups, are German by heritage. German immigrants continued to arrive in great numbers all throughout the 1800s and the 1900s, and there was actually an uptick in immigration in the 1930s as many German Jews were trying to escape hostility in Europe, of course, leading up to World War II, and many European Jews were persecuted. as you see on the slide, prior to World War I, so we're talking about the early, very early 20th century. Of course, World War I happened, you know, in the early, very early part of the century. There was a massive influx of Germans coming in. So, as I mentioned, so many Germans have come into this country, and they've been here for so long and come in such great numbers that the majority of people living in the United States have some sort of German ancestry. And the thing that's interesting about that is that I think that most people don't tend to think of the United States as having sort of a German flavor, but the thing is that Germans have been here for so long and in such great numbers that they really have influenced a lot of the way that we think about being American, and you know, giving that sort of flavor to majority American culture. We don't think of it as German necessarily, but in many ways it is. If we look at other Central European groups outside the Germans, we see that there are quite a few others that were coming to the United States in large numbers, not as large as the Germans. The Polish people were coming in about the same time as the Germans, the early 17th century. Of course, not quite as many of them as the Germans again, but generally the largest wave of Polish immigrants came in just before World War I, which started in 1914. So between 1860 and 1914, we saw the largest wave of people coming from Poland into the United States during that time. Unlike a lot of the Germans, many of the Poles were looking for economic opportunity, which they found. And many of them, when they came to the United States, they ended up settling in very heavily throughout the Midwest. And so throughout the Midwest, you'll see a lot of people with Polish ancestry. Later immigration after World War I ended in 1980, many people came to the United States just looking for escape from political upheaval going on in that area. And of course, there were, you know, a few years between when World War I ended and World War II started up, in the 20s, particularly the 30s. There was a lot of unrest happening, and so a lot of people in this part of the world decided to come to the United States to escape that. Other Central European groups, Austrians, Hungarians, came into the United States as well. Many of them came in during the 1800s and 1900s. Austrians and Hungarians, it's difficult to distinguish between them before the year 1910 because they were counted together. And in fact, the country or the region that they were from was referred to as the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which is incidentally where a lot of my ancestors came from. So they were sort of counted together, and like many groups early on, as we'll see throughout the world, they're just sort of lumped together, and so we don't have very good data about where exactly they came from until later. Many of those who immigrated to the United States did so prior to the beginning of World War II, so through the 30s and into the early 40s. The other group that we're going to talk about, you see on here, is referred to as the Roma. We're going to talk a little bit more about them because they're an interesting group. They don't actually have any national borders. They just sort of exist, well, in many areas throughout the world, as we'll see. And they also came to the United States in very small numbers. And we'll talk about them a little bit because they're pretty unique. At the bottom of this slide, you'll see the website for the Ellis Island. So if you have European ancestors that you think may have come in to the United States through Ellis Island, you can do a name check. So that's there if you want to take a look and see if any of your family is on that list. We'll switch to worldview for Central Europeans, and we'll start with religion. Major religious affiliation for Germans is Lutheranism, which is a Protestant denomination. And there are some Jewish and Roman Catholics throughout Germany as well. And of course, you know, this was reflected in the diaspora, the people that were leaving and immigrating elsewhere. Of course, as we mentioned in the previous slide, many of the very early Germans left for religious freedom, and many of those were Mennonites, which is another sect of Protestantism. And we see them today in the United States heavily concentrated in and around Pennsylvania. As we know, that area was heavily settled by the Germans, and some of the groups in there, such as the Amish and other Mennonite sects, still live in that area, and many of them still practice very simple lifestyles, and that's what they're known for. And as I mentioned previously, they also have been referred to as the Pennsylvania Dutch, which of course comes from the Deutsch, which means German. The Polish and the other Central Europeans, many of them are Roman Catholic, and it's interesting throughout Europe, you find that the closer people are to Rome, the more likely they are to be Catholic. And it's sort of interesting if you look at religious populations throughout Europe, you'll see that is very true across the board. So many of these people, of course, many of these countries are a little closer to Rome than Germany is, and so you'll see that reflected in the numbers in the Roman Catholic numbers in Central Europe as well. The Roma that we talked about in the previous slide, they are a group that exists heavily throughout Europe, although they're not European themselves. Their ancestry comes from northern India. So they're actually Asian Indian. And of course, over time, there has been some mixing of peoples throughout the time, although not a huge amount, because the Roma tend to keep to themselves, and they tend to see themselves as very pure ethnically, and we'll get into this a little bit more in the next slide, but their culture is designed to keep themselves pure and to avoid contamination with other groups. In terms of family, Germans reflect a lot of what we see in the United States today, and of course, as we mentioned early on, at its roots, European American roots are very heavily German, so it's not really surprising that there's a lot of reflection in terms of what family structure looks like. Although times have changed, one of the things that we see with traditional family structure in German families is that large families were encouraged, and this has to do with a few different things. One of them, of course, is religion, that large families were really seen as the way to go and the right thing to do, but also many of these families were farming families, and so the more children that you had, the more help you had on the farm. So, and we saw that in the United States as well with these early families. Many of them were farmers. They came over and they uh, bought land and started their own farms and families. And so, you know, personally, I can say that was certainly true for my family that came from this part of the world. They immigrated from Germany and from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, those areas, and they moved to the Midwest, and they farmed. And in the case of my family, they settled in North Dakota and did farming before they eventually moved out to California, some of them. So that was a very typical thing to have happen for people immigrating from this part of the world. One of the things that we also find, and this is true not only of Europeans, but you know, populations throughout the world that have immigrated to the United States, what happens is a group of people will go to one section of the United States and they'll develop organizations, fraternal groups, social clubs, churches, those sorts of things. And when newcomers from that part of the world, from Germany or Poland or wherever, come over to that area, they know that there's already a settlement of people like them, so they'll go there. So they'll go to the Midwest, or they'll go wherever they know has a large pocket of Polish or a large pocket of Czechoslovakians and those sorts of things, and they'll go there because things are familiar and the language is spoken and the food is familiar, and they know that there's a social outlet, which again many times was the church, that they could go and socialize. Traditional family structure, very common, so that the traditional definition of male and female roles, very common. Men outside the house, men doing the hard work on the farm, and women really ruling the home. So taking care of the child rearing and the home caring and those sorts of things. Although as we look at modern Europe today, modern Central Europe, and certainly here in the United States, there's been a shift to women working outside the home as being very acceptable. So that is not as much of an issue as it is with people from other parts of the world, as we've talked about, say from Latin America, coming in and that causing conflict. That doesn't seem to be as much of a problem with people that have immigrated here. And it may be, you know, as far as Central European immigrants, they've been here for so long that that's just sort of, you know, it's really become kind of the way if people want to live good lives, that, you know, they need to have dual incomes, and in many cases that is true today and throughout Europe. Children are generally encouraged to pursue higher education, so college education and advanced training is something that is very encouraged, again, both in Central Europe and really throughout much of Europe, as well as here in the United States. The Roma, as we continue to talk about them, because they're so insular, because they are really keep to themselves, they tend to intermarry with each other, and so there is, I mean, there has historically been some mixing, but not quite as much. And the Roma, another word that people use for them frequently are gypsies, which means it has a rather negative connotation, and it comes from other people throughout Central Europe looking at them as sort of this transient group that moves around a lot, and you know, they're associated with stealing things and just kind of unsavory activities. Doesn't mean that that's true, but that's kind of the connotation. And you know, the Roma, as we just mentioned, they're not European in ancestry. They come from somewhere else. They come from Asia. They come from, you know, northern India. And the idea that they're transient and they don't really settled down. They're just this unsettled ethnic group that's not like the majority population throughout Europe. They really cause some people to have negative feelings about them. So, but they see themselves as pure, and they see themselves as very important to marry like people. So, you know, Roma families are going to seek out other Roma families to intermarry with. And as I mentioned, we did have Roma come into the United States as well during that initial diaspora into the United States. And so there are people with Roma ancestry here, and you know, and practice their beliefs and their intermarriage here in the U.S. as well. So turning to health beliefs and practices, one of the things about German Americans is that they very frequently hold the view that illness is related to personal health behaviors. And of course, that's the basis of what we see in Western biomedicine. One of the beliefs is that depending on how well or not well you take care of yourself is going to determine if you get sick. And when we talk about taking care of yourself, we're really referring to strictly physically. So we're not looking as much at spiritual or mental or emotional health. It's just physical. And of course, that describes what we are talking about when we talk about Western biomedicine. So it's not surprising then that here in the United States, that biomedicine philosophy is really what traditional American culture tends to hang on to, because this is you know, rooted in this German ancestry that many of us have. However, it doesn't mean that there was no such thing as folk medicine for Germans in the old country, and even here in the United States. There were definitely things that that would be used, again, as we see so frequently, by the women. The women are the first line healers, and that certainly is true here in German and Central European households. They would use things like teas and poultices. A poultice is a bundle of materials that is put together and placed on a part of the body where the problem is happening. And I actually have a personal story with this. I was many years ago. I was when I was in high school. I had bronchitis. I had a really bad viral bronchitis, and was in bed for a couple of weeks. And during that time, I had horrible cough, I had laryngitis, I had all kinds of awful things happening. And my father had talked to some of my older aunts who had come from the old country. So again, we're talking about Germany and Austria, Hungary, that area. And they had, you know, all kinds of poultices that they thought would work for me. And so I remember being in bed and very sick, and I had, the next thing I knew, I had a whole group of my great aunts standing around my bed with, you know, cheesecloth and all these ingredients, and I wasn't sure what they were going to do with me. Well, what happened was the poultice that they felt would work for what I had was made out of raw bacon and onions. So that sounds about as wonderful as it actually was. They wrapped my neck in raw bacon and onions and wrapped the whole thing up in bandages. And so I had to sleep at night with this slimy, stinky poultice wrapped around my neck. And I was about 16 at the time, and I thought it was just the grossest thing I'd ever dealt with. But, you know, I woke up the next morning and I felt better than I had felt in about a week. So maybe there's something to it. So that's an example. Teas, liniments, those are things that can be rubbed on the skin to, provide healing to whatever part of the body is ailing you. Um, there was in early American Pennsylvania Deutsch territory, and of course practiced in the Old Country as well, a magico-religious practice, and I'll explain that more in just a second, but it was called brosh, as you see there in the slide. What practitioners of brosh were generally women, midwives, and what they would do is practice a combination of a mix of religion, so that Protestant religion mixed with magical incantations. And so things like, taking, working through God in such a way that the focus was to heal the patient, but by use of saying certain incantations or certain sayings in German or Old German would heal the patient. And so that was something that was not unusual in the Old Country, but also here in the United States among these early German settlers. Polish Americans and others throughout Central Europe also have religious and faith-based attitudes toward healing. So bringing God in through prayer and practice is something that was seen also as helpful in helping the patient heal up. Even today, one of the things that, if you look in mainstream American culture, one of the things that persists is the attitude that, if we sin or we go against God, among people who are religious, the idea that somehow a sickness or misfortune might come upon us is still present. And you can hear it sometimes when people talk about if I don't go to church or I don't pray or I don't I say something bad about God, then it may come back to haunt me. So we see vestiges of that in mainstream American culture here and there. The Roma, again, as far as traditional health beliefs and practices, their major concern is staying clean and pure. So they want to avoid contact with anything outside of Roma culture because they see that as a contaminating influence. Folk healers are very important here. They, practice their own special ways of healing. As we see throughout much of the Middle East and certainly the area where they come from, South Asia, and in that region we see that the left hand is never used for eating. Because that's used for personal care or toileting practices. So that's something that is seen as taboo with the Roma that is not taboo with people throughout Europe where they have settled in. When we turn to food habits in this part of the world, the entire territory that we're talking about today, not only Central Europe, but former Soviet Union and Scandinavia certainly, we're talking about the same climate. And so, interestingly, the food choices are very similar throughout all of these areas. There's some regional differences, like when we get to Scandinavia, we're going to talk a lot about seafood. But for the most part, these areas tend to have very harsh winters, and so harsh winters, cooler summers in a lot of the places. And what that means for food crops is that there's a limit on what sorts of things are going to grow there. So many parts of the world where lots of vegetables and other crops grow very freely, traditionally they didn't have the same luxury in these parts of the world. So a lot of what they eat traditionally are foods that tend to thrive in those conditions. And so we're talking about cabbage, and we're talking about potatoes, beans. We're talking about a lot of grains such as rye, wheat in many cases. And so the overall flavors that result from a lot of this are very bland but very hearty, kind of stick to your ribs fare. So the flavors that come out of this in many cases are, as we'll see in the next few slides, really the flavors of the preservation techniques used to keep foods during the summer, because in many of these areas winter was so harsh and really nothing was growing during that time, that if you hadn't taken the time to preserve your food when it was harvested, then you were going to starve during the summer and maybe die. So this is where preservation comes in. So this is the salting of the food, and the pickling, and the fermenting, and the curing, and the drying, and all of these techniques came through and imparted their flavors to the food. And for many of these cuisines, it's the hallmark of the hallmark flavor of the cuisine that defines it in many cases. So common ingredients, as I talked about in the previous slide, include potatoes, beans, and cabbage. Again, those are very cold and cool weather crops. Root crops such as beets and carrots are not uncommon. Eggs, dairy product, lots of meat, because generally, even if you couldn't pick vegetables during the winter, you could have meat if you had animals year-round. Apples, rye, wheat, and barley crops as well that could be made into breads. Bread is a very important staple throughout many of these areas, and typically breads are made with dark grains such as rye. Those are very common throughout this area. The preservation techniques included fermentation. So if you think of something like sauerkraut, if you've ever experienced that, it's cabbage and sometimes other vegetables that have been chopped up and salted and then essentially left to rot. And what happens is bacteria takes over and decomposes the food, but in that decomposition it imparts other flavors and a sourness that makes plain cabbage, which doesn't taste like much on its own, have a really nice kind of salty sour flavor that is very much a traditional flavor that you see throughout this region. Smoked meats and dried meats, things, if you wanted to preserve meat, those were reliable ways to make that happen. So you could smoke it over a fire, you could season it and dry it out. Pickling, pickling is very common, so that's using some sort of a salty brine, a liquid with salt in it. And a lot of times other spices were added to it to give their flavors to the vegetables as well. So things like cucumbers and other vegetables could be pickled in the summertime when they were harvested and then enjoyed during the harsh winter. The picture that you see on here is something called bigos, which is a Polish hunter's stew. It's topped with sausages. It's essentially a stew that is made with various kind of meat. Pork is real common, and the stew is made with sauerkraut. So it's really sort of a meat and cabbage stew, and it's actually very tasty. I went to a Polish dinner a couple of years ago and had bigos myself, and while I'm not a big fan generally of sausage or sauerkraut or cabbage for that matter, the way that it was brought together in this dish, it was really tasty, so I was impressed with that. So while breads are real common in the cuisine of this area, another way that grains are used is for dumplings. And you see dumplings everywhere throughout this region. Um, Dumplings are made with wheat flour generally, made into sort of something like pasta almost. And then in many cases they're filled. Sometimes they're not. The Germans have a type of dumpling, and you see in the lower picture here, it's called Spatzel. And Spatzel is it's made sort of an interesting way. It's a dough that's made with wheat flour, and then it's put into a pot of boiling water, the dough. On the top picture you see a Spatzel maker, and essentially what that is just sort of a board that has holes in it, and you put the dough, which is a very wet, sort of gloopy dough, over the pot of water on the board, and you just run this smaller piece back and forth over it to force the dough through into the water. And then it boils up, and it's kind of like a pasta-like texture. And when you cook it, it looks almost like sort of looks like scrambled eggs almost. And then typically what they do is they once it's boiled and ready to go, they'll take it out of the water, and sometimes they'll saute it in some sort of a fat, usually butter, and season it up, and then they'll serve it with a meat dish real frequently. So again, in that bottom slide, you see Spatzel with Schnitzel, which is something you probably don't want to try to say 10 times fast. But Schnitzel is a breaded cutlet. It's usually pork or chicken, and it's pounded real thin, and it's breaded on both sides. Served frequently with schnitzel, and there's usually some sort of a sauce with it. It might be dill-based or lemon-based or something like that. The Polish have pierogies. That's one type of dumpling that they have, and I actually had a picture of that on the previous slide. It's just a dough pocket that's filled with, it could be anything, but very frequently pierogies are stuffed with seasoned potato. The Russians have pelmeni, which is same idea as the pierogi, although they tend to be a little bit smaller. And very frequently those are stuffed with meat. Pork is really common. And actually pork is very common throughout this area because it's a little cheaper, and it's easily available. Although you'll also see these dumplings stuffed with beef and poultry sometimes as well. Sausages, extremely important throughout this area. Germany is kind of, when you think of German food, it's hard to think about that without thinking about sausages. And if you think about it, sausages were also sort of a way to help preserve meat. And so essentially what a sausage is it's meat and sometimes other foods put in there as well. There might be grains in there. There might be various types of meat, spices, seasonings. Sometimes, all parts of the animal were used, including blood, and they were all mixed together and then put in casings, and then they could be preserved. So Germany produces, well, you can see on the slide here, 12 to 1,500 different types, and there's probably even more than that. But they're a big sausage making country, although throughout this region, all throughout Central Europe, into the Soviet Union and even into Scandinavia, you'll see different types of sausage as a way to stretch meat and to help preserve it. Something else you see real commonly in this area are dishes that are made of stuffed cabbage leaves. This is a real different areas throughout the, Central Europe and former Soviet Union in particular are going to have stuffed cabbage dishes that are just cabbage leaves that have been blanched and then filled with, it's usually a mixture of ground meat. Beef is really common. and ground meat that's been mixed with other ingredients, such as onions. You see that real frequently, and then other seasonings that that have been put in there as well. And then usually the cabbage leaves are they're boiled, or they can be baked. Sometimes they're put in a tomato sauce. But much like the dumplings, all of these regions have their own versions of stuffed cabbage leaves. It just kind of depends on where you are, what the cabbage leaves are going to be stuffed with. In the case of my family, again, the German, Hungary, Austrian ancestry that I have, the version that they have is called sarma. And sarma is, again, the stuffed cabbage leaves with beef, and there's some tomato in there as well. So it's not a fancy dish, but it's simple and hearty, and really pretty typical of the types of dishes that you'll find in this region. I wanted to include a slide on paprika here. I think it's important to talk about this when we talk about Central Europe, because it plays an important part in defining the cuisine of one of our countries here in Central Europe, and that is Hungary. If you've ever heard of Hungarian goulash, which is probably arguably the dish that most Americans might at least have heard of, without actually maybe having even eaten it. It features paprika. And paprika itself, people may or may not know what that is, but paprika is actually a chili pepper, which we know chili peppers are not native to Europe, but came from the New World. And it's one of those ingredients that was imported and really took off in a particular area. But the story with what happened was, of course, we know that the Spanish and the Portuguese came to the Americas and brought all sorts of foods back to Europe. And what happened was these foods were brought back in the 17th century. And actually the Turkish people took it from Europe and used it in their own cuisine, but then they reintroduced it to Europe to Hungary, to Hungarians in particular, which happened in the 1600s, 17th century. So what happened was this particular chili really took off, and Hungarians were able to grow it, and over time it really became a defining flavor of their cuisine. Dishes that feature paprika are generally designated with the word paprikash. So you see it really commonly in stews and sauces and those sorts of things throughout paprika. If you've ever shopped for paprika, you'll see that it comes in different varieties. You can get hot paprika, sweet paprika, smoked paprika. And of course, depending on the type you choose is going to affect the flavor of your food. And the picture that you see here is the Great Market Hall in Budapest in Hungary. And you can see the chilies hanging in those long sort of lines. Those are called ristras, though I'm not really sure what they call them in Hungary, but that's what they are. And of course they're dried up and ground and used throughout Hungary and Hungarian cuisine. We're going to turn our attention to Scandinavia. In particular, we're talking about 5 different countries, 4 of which are listed in this picture. Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Finland, and Iceland are what we'll be talking about. We'll talk a little bit about American immigration as far as Scandinavians go. You can see that the majority of Scandinavian immigration occurred from the mid-19th to the mid-20th century, and a lot of these immigrants ended up in much of the Midwest, in particular Minnesota, Illinois, Iowa, Wisconsin, and Michigan. And a smaller but very significant population is found in the Northwest, in the Seattle area. A lot of those original settlers to the Midwest left that area to the Northwest for opportunities in the fishing and timber industries. If you go to Seattle nowadays, an area north of Seattle is called Ballard, and that is one of those enclaves of Scandinavians. And in the picture, you see there the Nordic Heritage Museum, which is in Ballard, the Ballard section of Seattle, and lots of signage and flags and Scandinavian heritage and pride in that area. The majority of Scandinavian immigrants come to the U.S. from Sweden and Norway. They vastly outnumber immigrants from the other countries. Finland and Denmark and Iceland, there certainly is immigration, but the numbers are significantly smaller than the folks coming from Sweden and Norway. And this is a map in the year 2000. This was a grid of where there's a lot of Scandinavian settlements, or people who have Scandinavian ancestry. And you can see certainly there in Minnesota, there's lots and lots of people with Scandinavian heritage, and certainly in the state of Washington. And interestingly, there is a band in a good band there in Utah as well. Scandinavia, the countries that make up Scandinavia, are really sort of interesting in that they are examples of very feminine cultures. And if you remember when we talked about masculine and feminine cultures, one of the big things about Scandinavia is that quality of life issues are very, very important. And the people who live in Scandinavian countries are willing to sacrifice things and pay more for that quality of life. So generally what that means is that they don't work themselves to death. Time off is very important. Family is very important. And those are things that we don't see in the U.S. or many other cultures that are a little bit more focused on production and work and stress and all those things that come along with it. The other thing that's interesting about Scandinavia, and that sort of sets it apart a bit, is that globally, as you see the first point on this slide, no countries offer equality in the workplace between men and women as much as in Scandinavia. Men and women are virtually compensated the same, and they're seen as very much equals. Education is extremely valued, and children are very encouraged to get as much education as they can, because ultimately, as you see here, education is valued as a way to raise economic status. Overall, Scandinavian countries are generally more secular. Scandinavia is quite far from Rome, and so we don't see much in the way of Roman Catholicism there. They identify primarily with Lutheran, which again, as with the Germans I mentioned, that is a Protestant religion. But they're not very openly religious. That is, the society is very, very secular. They keep their religion very separate from day-to-day activity. More socially progressive, generally they're just fine with same-sex marriages. There's a lot of comfort with, as you see there, nudity in adult language and media is not seen as terribly controversial. They tend to be very green. Part of that is because there are a lot of natural resources, a lot of wind, a lot of water, a lot of thermal energy underneath the earth, volcanic activity, and those sorts of things. And they've been very good at harnessing those things to be very green. And that is something that tends to be important to people of Scandinavian culture in those countries. Being green and being friendly to the environment has been rather important. Traditional health beliefs and patterns. One of the things, I have a shot there of the Swedish sauna. You have to put that. Also, massage is very commonly used therapeutically. Fish is eaten for good health. And certainly there is a lot of importance. Biomedicine is seen as important, but these home and personal treatments, massage and sauna, are seen as quite important as well. You can't really talk about the Scandinavian food story without talking about fish, and that's not real surprising because if you look at Scandinavia, it's got tons of coastline, and so fish is extremely common throughout all the Scandinavian countries. As with other cold weather countries, the flavor of the food, again, frequently comes from preservation. And in the case of fish, some of the things that they do with it are, as you see in the picture here, gravlax, pardon me, is a way of preserving fish by essentially curing it. So you'll take a fish like salmon and you'll put a bunch of different spices on it. So it might include dill and mustard seeds and lots of salt, which essentially dries the fish out. And if you put enough salt on the meat, it's going to keep any bacteria on the surface from spoiling the fish. And the spices obviously are going to give it a flavor that you will find desirable if gravlax is something that you enjoy eating. So this is actually something that when I was in culinary school I had to make gravlax, and it was really interesting and actually quite good. Fermenting fish is also something that you see in Scandinavia, a lot of parts of Scandinavia. Attached to this module, you're going to see the making of a product called hakarl, which is basically rotted shark, which sounds terrible, but again, in a situation where you have to hunt and then preserve foods to get you through a long winter in order to survive, over thousands of years, these techniques, they mature and people develop a taste for them. So you may have heard of lutefisk. Lutefisk is essentially a dried whitefish, a whitefish that's been processed and then dried and then reconstituted, and so it forms almost like a sort of a jelly-like texture. It's definitely an acquired taste. So that was something that, to have food year-round, you could have preserved fish like that. Interestingly, lutefisk is nowadays more consumed here in the United States than in Scandinavia. That the thought on that is that it has probably more to do with ethnic pride of people that share Scandinavian ethnicity, that to eat something like lutefisk, even though it's definitely an acquired taste, is something that I guess helps people retain their connection with their ancestry. Curing, breading, steaming, frying, those are all things that they do with fish, again, to preserve it. I have a quote on here from Anthony Bourdain describing hakarl as the single worst, most disgusting, terrible tasting thing he's ever eaten. And you'll see in the video the whole process on that. But essentially, What it does is it really concentrates the flavor of the decomposing flesh of this whale that they use for this. It's a shark, excuse me, it's a Greenland shark, and you'll see that in the video. And it really concentrates the ammonia flavor. So if you've ever smelled ammonia, it is definitely an acquired flavor, but in Iceland in particular, that is delicacy and something that people eat to kind of have pride in their ethnicity. Fermented dairy products are also really common here. Again, you may have animals that produce dairy, and certainly can produce dairy throughout the winter, and so things like butter and sour cream and buttermilk and cheese and things like that, those are things that you also see throughout Scandinavia, and those can be preserved as well and eaten with a lot of these dishes.
In the areas of Scandinavia that are not as close to the water, we see increased meat content. They still eat fish in those parts of Scandinavia, but we see more meat than they might eat around the edges near the water. Meats that are most common in pretty much all the Scandinavian territories are pork, mutton, lamb. Veal is really common. Beef is not quite as common, but it is seen. The other frequently seen meats are the game meats, so things like reindeer, elk, venison show up very frequently. In the picture here you see a dish called jodkaka, which is Norwegian meat cakes. They're essentially very large meatballs that are kind of flattened a little bit, and they are seasoned with ginger. Typically they're served in a brown gravy with lingonberries, and you see some lingonberry jam there. As far as fruits go, as we talked about in Central Europe, a lot of the more delicate fruits are not seen so much in this area because of climate reasons, and that's certainly true for Scandinavia. What we tend to see are more cool weather hardy fruits like apples and lots of berries. There's lots of berries in Scandinavian cuisine. Many of the berries we don't see here in the United States so much unless you happen to be in an IKEA, which if you want to try any of the jams from these specific Scandinavian berries, they do have them. Lingonberries are one, gooseberries, cloudberries. Those are all very common in Scandinavian cuisine. Very frequently they're turned into jams and jellies because, again, that's a way to preserve them. So there's a very short season for the Scandinavian food tradition that most Americans are probably familiar with is the smorgasbord, which you can see in the picture here. A smorgasbord is basically a buffet where you are served small portions of several different types of food. And the smorgasbord originated in Sweden, and the concept is pretty much the same as buffets that we might be familiar with, and that there are a variety of hot and cold dishes that are available. Traditionally, smorgasbord starts with fish dishes, and it progresses through a different series of whatever dishes are available. There may or may not be dessert included on the smorgasbord. That's not something that's an integral part of the traditional smorgasbord. And you can see some of the special occasions in Scandinavia. Midsummer's Day is a special food occasion. Fish berries, boiled new potatoes are traditional. Christmas Eve generally involves a special smorgasbord called a julebord, which literally means Christmas table. So it's usually a very lavish, very expensive, rich meal that is, traditional holiday meal. Like even here in the United States, our Thanksgiving and Christmas meals tend to be more lavish than the typical meals that we might have the rest of the year. Let's switch gears a little bit and talk about the former Soviet Union. Of course, communism in that area fell in 1989, and there were all sorts of changes that happened through the 90s, one of which was several of the former Soviet states and territories became sovereign. So when we talk about these Commonwealth of Independent States, the Baltic regions, you see them all listed there. I'm not going to say them all because there's a lot of them, but you see them listed here. And on the map, you can see that it is a really, really large area, huge land mass. And this land mass encompasses lots of different types of land, from very arid plains to more fertile areas near the water, inland areas, and so on and so forth. So a lot of different territories and a lot of different peoples in these areas as well. As far as U.S. immigration trends, it's been ongoing for quite a while. In these statistics that you see that are from 2008, there are an estimated 3 million Russian Americans in this country at this time. 963 Ukrainian, 710 Lithuanian, and 421,000 Armenians in the U.S. And the thing with immigration from this area, the former Soviet Union, is that it is ongoing. We are seeing continual immigration of this part of the world into the United States. Generally, most of the immigrants from this area are pretty well educated. At least half of them tend to have university degrees, and many of them are professional. One of the things that's going on right now in Russia, in the former Soviet Union, is there is a reduction in people who are educated. As you see, I have listed here technoflight. A lot of them are coming to the United States because there's more opportunity. And so that's a problem for these Russian territories and former Soviet states, is that they're really losing out because there isn't nearly as much opportunity to keep those people in their homelands. As you see here, Russians are the fourth distinct wave of immigration to our country. We've talked about in previous lectures, there are some areas of the world that are continually attracting, America is continually attracting people from different parts of the world, such as Latin America. But Russians, as I said, there's a big influx of Russians that is ongoing into our country, and certainly over the last 50 years.
In the Soviet Union, which of course had a communist government, religion was banned, and so didn't mean that people didn't practice it, but they needed to be a little more secretive when they did that. And when communism was removed from the former Soviet Union in the late 80s, people again were able to practice their religion openly. And certainly among immigrants from the different countries that now make up the former Soviet Union coming here to the United States, many of them are not only free to practice their religion, but in many cases very eager to do so. The territory that was covered by the Soviet Union amasses just an amazing amount of territory. It's a very large landmass, and as you can imagine, this makes up, not only a large area, but also a large collection of different peoples of lots of different ethnicities all throughout. And so, of course, this is going to be represented in religion, certainly. So throughout this territory, we see a lot of Eastern Orthodox, certainly the Russian Orthodox Church, which is a Christian denomination and part of that Eastern Orthodoxy. And in the picture here, you see the Russian Orthodox Church at 714 13th Street, which, if memory serves, I believe that's near 13th and G. So you can go take a look at that sometime if you happen to be in the area. You see it's a beautiful building. It's got the golden onion domes that you see so frequently on Russian churches. The people that are members of that church, women in particular, tend to be very modest in dress. I do some private consulting with some Russian adult day healthcare centers here in the region, and one of the things that I notice about the women is that they always wear something on their head, whether it's a scarf or a hat. And part of that is to demonstrate their piety. So they very frequently will wear dresses. I rarely see these Russian women wearing pants. That's sort of a no-no. But that's part of this church. It's very common that you see that, especially among older Russian immigrants. There are a lot of Jews throughout the former Soviet Union. Vast majority of them are in Russia. So it's estimated about 1.5 to 1.7 million people who identify as Jewish. And they're, as I said, kind of scattered throughout the former Soviet Union, but the vast majority of them are in Russia. There are Roman Catholics. You see many of those in the Ukraine and Lithuania. Armenian Apostolic Church, which is another Eastern Orthodox church. There are several Orthodox churches, not only in former Soviet Union, but in other parts of the world as well, that identify as Eastern Orthodox. And Muslims, so they're people that practice Islam in very specific parts of the former Soviet Union, more in the southern part, near the Caucasus region, which is kind of the border where Europe and Asia meet. So places like Azerbaijan, which connects into Iran, you see a lot of people who practice Islam in that area.
Family groups. Traditionally, families were pretty large. Women were generally pretty dependent on their husbands. Interestingly, communism, the switch to communism, opened up a lot of opportunities for women to not be so dependent on the men of the family. They were able to work, and there were a lot of employment opportunities that hadn't previously been available. Generally, once people from this area immigrate to the United States, like so many different cultures, they tend to have smaller families. Women have to work, they don't have as much time to stay home and take care of lots of families. Also, like many other cultures that we've talked about, there's great respect for elders among the territories of the former Soviet Union. The picture that you see here is from the Russian school that's associated with the Russian Orthodox Church in Sacramento. Education is very valued, particularly science. In the science fields, parents tend to encourage their kids to achieve in those areas. Historically, Russians have excelled in areas of math and science, particularly chemistry and physics. We owe the periodic table to Russian scientists. So college education is very high priority. It's seen as getting ahead and excelling economically. Like many immigrants that come to this country for their children, a lot of times they seek out schools that are culturally reflect cultural values. So certainly this is a Russian school, there's Russian language. A lot of these kids may speak English, and many times children will end up translating for parents or shifting to food habits. It's pretty much the same story that we've talked about for all of the territories that we've talked about today. The interesting thing is that despite the fact that Russia and the former Soviet Union, all of the states, despite the fact that they encompass a tremendously large geographic area, the variety and differences in food among regions are not really that strong. Some of the countries that we've talked about, like Mexico, for instance, there's very big differences in what people eat depending on where in the country they are. And that's not really true for the former Soviet Union. We find that for the most part, staples are pretty much the same. And a lot of that is dictated by the fact, again, as we've talked about, growing conditions and climate. A lot of the food is dependent on what can survive in very cold and harsh conditions. So again, we see lots of cabbage, lots of root vegetables, potatoes, beets, those sorts of things that can thrive in very long winters and very short summers and growing seasons.
Common staples throughout the former Soviet Union include dark breads, as we've talked about in other areas, particularly rye, and buckwheat. Buckwheat is also called kasha, and it's sort of an interesting grain. It's something that you see used throughout former Soviet Union, and you also see it some places in Asia, in the Far East, Japan. They'll make noodles out of it. Buckwheat is it's not a grain, it's actually a seed, and but it's used like grain, so you can make noodles and bread, and very frequently many people in this area will just eat it as a grain in and of itself, kind of like people would eat rice. Thing about buckwheat is because it's a seed and not an actual grain, is that it's very, very high in protein and very high in fiber, so it's very nutritious stuff. But it doesn't have a whole lot of flavor on its own like rice does, although it can have a little bit of a bitter edge to it sometimes. Like most other areas in this region, the fresh fruits and vegetables difficult to find during the winter, so pickling and canning were really common here. The meal pattern very frequently revolves around soups and stews, and some sort of bread offered with them. This is extremely common throughout the area, throughout the territory that we're talking about. So some things that you may have heard of, borscht is a soup that's made with beets and other vegetables. Probably the most common dish that, you know, people, when they think of Russian cuisine, that might be the first one that they think of. In the picture, I have a soup called rasolnik, and that's sort of an interesting one. It's made with organ meats frequently, so kidneys are real common in this one, and they flavor it with pickle juice, so pickle brine. Usually some kind of brine from a pickled vegetable is added to give it kind of a salty, sour flavor. Cabbage soup, again, cabbage really common throughout this area. Cabbage and vegetables, super common, and always served with dark bread such as rye. Fish and meats are common, certainly. Much of this territory, former Soviet Union, is landlocked, but in places where there are lakes or rivers, seafood is common. Sturgeon is a real common fish. Sturgeon is the fish where some of the world's most prized caviar comes from. So caviar is something that is eaten throughout the territory. In particular, beluga, which come from the largest sturgeon, producing the larger eggs, and then smaller sturgeon producing other grades of caviar, savruga and osetra, which have their own flavors. And caviar eggs are usually salted and then packed and compressed in some cases, and are used very widely throughout the former Soviet Union. As with many of the other countries that we've been talking about in this area, dairy products are very common, again, because you have dairy producing animals that give a really good supply of milk and cheese and fermented dairy products, whether it's regardless of the time of year, whether it's the dead of winter or in the spring or some other time of year, dairy is easy to get. So you see those represented throughout the former Soviet Union. Sour cream in particular is used very widely and with everything. I guess you could sort of look at it as kind of the Russian version of ranch in the United States. It's offered with everything and they put it on everything. So very common. Buttermilk is also common. Kefir is sort of a drinkable yogurt is maybe the best way to explain what that is, and it can come in different flavors or just plain, but again, it's a cultured dairy product that is consumed widely throughout the region. So we're going to round out our discussion of the former Soviet Union by talking about beverages. Tea, by far the most common, and as you can see here, Russians are among those who consume the most tea in the world. I've got a couple other beverages on here that are is sort of unique to the area, although you know, we can see equivalent drinks in other parts of the world. Kvass is probably the one that is probably most unique. It's actually somewhat similar to beer. It's like a very low alcohol beer. It's a grain drink that's fermented, much like beer, but it has a really low alcohol content, and frequently it's flavored with other things. So it's you know, like fruit or something like that. So it's just kind of a refreshing, kind of lightly sparkly, low alcohol content beverage. So it's real common. The picture you see there is a kvass vendor in Kiev. Medovuka is one that is sort of like mead, which is a wine that is made with honey that's been fermented. And that's an older drink. That one's been made since the 14th century and was a little bit more popular in that time than it is now. Vodka, of course, I think we've all heard of, is an alcoholic beverage that's made with grain or frequently potatoes and fermented and alcoholic. And then beer is also pretty common. It's been made in Russia as early as the 9th century, which is actually kind of late when you look at the history of beer in the world context. But in Russia, 9th century, still pretty long time ago. All right, that is our lecture on Central Europe, Scandinavia, and the former Soviet Union.